So a commenter leveled an accusation that I've heard multiple times before, that Jews were kicked out of over 100 countries in history, and just demonstrating an all too common intellectual adolescence, or just a lack of correct information. So I asked GROK 3 the question, how many historical expulsions of Jews from various nations might actually be the result of voluntary movement by the Jewish population, which was spun as expulsions to prevent the host nations from being embarrassed by loss of Jewish brain power. So GROK 3 responds. Usually it responds with this pat answer that's kind of the the establishment consensus, right? And then when it starts getting down to the nitty-gritty, that's when it starts revealing the real evidence, right? So it's doing the same thing here. I have to wonder whether GROK 4 is any better than GROK 3. So GROK 3 says no reliable historical data or evidence directly supports the claim that a significant number of Jewish expulsions from various nations were actually voluntary movements disguised as expulsions. That's not what I said. To prevent host nations from being embarrassed by the loss of Jewish intellectual contributions. So yeah, I did say, or ask rather, that maybe these host nations had to spin the voluntary movement of Jews out of their country as an expulsion in order to save face. The idea that expulsions were a cover for voluntary Jewish migration to avoid national embarrassment is largely speculative. Well, yeah, that's why I asked the question, and not substantiated by primary sources or mainstream historical scholarship. Well, why would it be when, I've suggested that maybe the narrative about expulsions is a cover for actual Jewish voluntary movement out of the various nations. However, the question raises an interesting angle on historical narratives, so let's explore it critically, considering both the context of Jewish expulsions and the potential for reinterpretation. So now, the characterization of Jews as such an odious people that they were kicked out of 100 nations, different nations throughout history, I guess, suggests that there's something about Jews that you really just need to kick them out of your country, that they don't really contribute to your community, that they're an element that you're going to want to kick out of your country. And yet when Jews try to return to their homeland, Gentiles also get pissed about that and tell Jews to go back where they came from, which would be like Europe and other nations, like North Africa, Ethiopia, for example. But then when the Jews would go back to those nations, then the Gentiles in those nations would tell them to go back where they came from, meaning their homeland. So there's really no place that Jews can go that will make Gentiles happy. It's just that Gentiles are racist fucks who, can't allow Jews to have a place to live anywhere in the world, even though that they're only 0.3% of the world's population. They can't seem to find a plot of land big enough for Jews to live in peace. By the way, I'm not Jewish. I'm a Gentile, but I'm a Gentile who got to know some Jews, and found out that Jews are actually telling the truth, and it's really Gentiles who are the fucking hand-wringing, sinister liars that they paint Jews out to be. So, historical context of Jewish expulsions. Historical records document numerous instances of Jewish expulsions across centuries, particularly in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Okay, so the Middle East, North Africa, what does that tell you? Islamic, right? Islamic reasons there, because we know that Islam isn't exactly cool with Jews. They'll say, "Oh, but we allow Jews to be Dehimis." Oh, what a privilege to pay the Dehimi tax to the jihadist and fundamentalist Muslims who will turn around and rape your daughters, whenever they get a wild hair up their keister. So, Europe, medieval to early, let's see, these events are often tied to specific political, economic, religious, or social factors as outlined in sources like the Encyclopedia Judaica and historical accounts. Europe, medieval to early modern period. Jews were expelled from England in 1290, France in 1306 and 1394, Spain in 1492, Portugal in 1497, and various German and Italian states, among others. These expulsions were typically justified by religious intolerance, for example, accusations of Christ killing or blood libels, economic scapegoating, for example, resentment of Jewish moneylenders. Never mind that the church forced Jews into these occupations, or emerging nationalist sentiments that viewed Jews as outsiders. For example, Edward I's edict of expulsion in England was linked to economic pressures and parliamentary negotiations for taxation, with Jews' wealth confiscated upon departure. Similarly, Spain's Alhambra decree under Ferdinand and Isabella aimed to religiously homogenize the kingdom. This was about the time of the Spanish Inquisition, wasn't it? Forcing Jews to convert or leave. Isn't that great? Convert or leave, with estimates of 40,000 to 200,000 departing. So it sounds like that was a voluntary departure. If they were given the choice to convert or leave and they decided to leave, that was a voluntary departure. As for these forced departures, it's pretty clear that these happened because Gentiles were fucking assholes. Middle East and North Africa, 20th century. Between 1948 and the early 1970s, approximately 900,000 Jews left or were expelled. Left or were expelled. So there's a voluntary movement potential there from Arab and Muslim majority countries following the establishment of Israel. These movements were driven by a mix of state-sponsored discrimination, for example, denationalization, property confiscation, pogroms, and anti-Zionist policies as seen in Egypt, Iraq, and Libya. While some Jews left voluntarily due to Zionist pull factors or economic prospects in Israel, many faced coercive push factors, including violence and legal restrictions. So, if the Jews left voluntarily, that doesn't fit into your accusation that they were kicked out of a country for some reason. And as far as the cases where they were forcibly kicked out, That's obviously, again, because Gentiles were assholes. Evaluating the voluntary movement hypothesis. The hypothesis that expulsions were actually voluntary migrations spun as forced to preserve national pride hinges on the idea that Jewish intellectual and economic contributions were so vital that their departure would embarrass host nations. Let's break this down. No one said anything about that they were so vital, but when a whole race of people gets up and leaves from your country, that might be kind of embarrassing. That might suggest that there is something about your country that would make someone want to leave it. Jewish intellectual contributions. Jews have historically been overrepresented in intellectual, economic, and cultural spheres relative to their population size, often due to cultural emphasis on education. Wow, that's such a bad thing. Cultural emphasis on education. So Jews were more educated than Gentiles, but that's a reason to kick them out of your country. And adaptation to restricted professions. For example, trade, finance, and medicine. Professions that the church forced them into. For instance, in medieval Europe, Jews were key financiers and merchants, and in the 20th century, and then they try to paint that's because the Jews were money grubbers, right? Leaving out the fact that it was the church that forced them into those professions. Jews were key financiers and merchants, and in the 20th century, Jewish scientists, writers, and professionals were prominent in Europe and the Middle East. So let's see. So Jews were more educated and more intelligent than Gentiles, but that was a reason to kick them out of your countries, right? The loss of such talent could theoretically, and this is really on the flip side, you've got the derpy Gentiles who entertain these racist ideas, right? They're just so uneducated and unintelligent that they've adopted these beliefs. So they need Jews to be the scapegoat for their ineffectual lives because they didn't seek education or they didn't improve their intellects, if that's even possible. I'm not sure that it is. Maybe it is. But let's blame the Jews for what's wrong with my life, right? The loss of such talent could theoretically impact a nation's economy or prestige, as seen in post-expulsion Spain, where some historians argue the economy stagnated partly due to the loss of Jewish and converso merchants. So, there you have it. You kick the Jews out of your country, you kick out your brain power, and it might have negative effects on your country, whereas you thought that the presence of Jews in your country was having a negative effect on your country, when clearly it had quite the opposite effect on your country. Evidence for voluntary movement. Some Jewish migrations were indeed voluntary, particularly in contexts where economic opportunities or ideological motivations, for example Zionism, played a role. For example, in the Hellenistic and early Roman periods, Jews migrated to cities like Alexandria for trade and cultural opportunities, as noted by historians like Stephen Bowman. Note that Alexandria is appropriate to say is Alexandria still, does it still exist as a city these days? Anyway, whatever the case, back then Alexandria, its location, is right there in the Mediterranean, not far from Israel, so it's not like they had to go a long distance to move there. Also, there was something about a second temple in Heliopolis, I think. that was erected by these Alexandrian Jews, and supposedly it had the approval of Jerusalem Jews. I don't know about that. But I think that there, if I remember correctly, I think there may actually be a prophecy in Isaiah about that second temple in Heliopolis, or at least words that are interpreted as a prophecy about that temple. In the 20th century, some Jews from Arab countries chose to immigrate to Israel due to Zionist ideals or better prospects. Though this was often alongside coercive pressures. However, these voluntary migrations are typically distinguished from expulsions in historical records. Expulsions, because you're probably not going to get much in the way of records for voluntary migrations if those migrations were legal and allowed. Expulsions, by contrast, are characterized by royal decrees, legal mandates, or mob violence, with Jews often stripped of property and rights, as in England in 1290, Spain 1492, or Egypt in 1956. Again, Gentiles being assholes. Spinning voluntary movement as expulsion. The idea that host nations reframed voluntary Jewish departures as expulsions to avoid embarrassment lacks direct evidence. As it would if it was truly reframed. Historical narratives of expulsions were often crafted by the expelling authorities to justify their actions, not to cover up voluntary exits. Well, you wouldn't know if the narrative was reframed. You wouldn't know. In other words, the victors write the history. So the people who were left in the country, the natives, they would have spun the history as if it was an expulsion when it might have been a voluntary movement. And then you would never know that it was a voluntary movement. In medieval Europe, expulsions were framed as protecting Christian society from perceived religious or economic threats, not as masking Jewish agency. Again, I'm not saying the reframing would have had any concern about why the Jews left. Chronicles from the time, like those surrounding Edward I's expulsion, emphasize anti-Jewish sentiment and economic gain, for example, debt cancellation and property seizure. Again, Gentiles being assholes. And yet, we're supposed to understand from these supposed 100 plus expulsions from different nations that it was because the Jews were to blame. So not only do you injure them by kicking them out, but then you insult them after you've kicked them out. It's kind of like, when you break up with your girlfriend and you're the abusive boyfriend, you break up with your girlfriend and then you have all kinds of choice things to say about her after you've kicked her to the curb. In Arab countries post-1940, and especially if she left you voluntarily, in Arab countries post-1948, governments often publicized Jewish departures to align with anti-Zionist policies, not to hide embarrassment. Governments often publicize Jewish departures to align with anti-Zionist policies, not to hide embarrassment. Yeah, because in Arab countries, Muslims would not be embarrassed by the loss of Jewish brain power, because that's Islam. In Egypt, Jews were forced to sign declarations voluntarily relinquishing property, but voluntarily is in quotation marks, but this was a legal formality to legitimize confiscation, not a cover for voluntary migration. So in other words, the Gentiles were the thieves. The Gentiles were the assholes. If anything, host nations had little incentive to frame voluntary departures as expulsions. So it sounds like generally the Gentiles were butthurt that Jews were so successful and that Jews didn't waste their money on a bunch of dumb shit like alcohol, and so then they kicked them out and took all their stuff. If anything, host nations had little incentive to frame voluntary departures as expulsions, as doing so would highlight their loss of a productive minority. Instead, they often but if you said you expelled them from your country, then you lost a productive minority. Instead, they often downplayed Jewish contributions or scapegoated them to justify expulsions. So it's for all these crimes that Jew haters want us to assume the worst about Jews from their supposedly being expelled by 100 plus countries. Counter-arguments and challenges. Primary sources. Most expulsions are documented through royal edicts, chronicles, or Jewish testimonies. For example, Joseph HaKohen's Emek Habacha, which describe coercion, violence, or property loss. Voluntary migrations like those to Poland, Lithuania in the Middle Ages are noted separately, often as responses to persecution elsewhere. Motivations of host nations. Expulsions often served immediate economic or political goals, such as debt cancellation, England in 1290, or religious unification, Spain 1492. In other words, religious intolerance. And then debt cancellation, we could just call that theft. Framing these as voluntary would undermine the ruler's ability to seize assets or rally public support. Jewish sources, like those from the Spanish expulsion, emphasize trauma and loss, not strategic voluntary exit. The Sephardic diaspora's cultural memory, as seen in Ladino literature, reflects forced displacement, not a calculated departure to preserve host nation's pride. I did not anywhere suggest that the Jews might have left in order to preserve the host nation's pride. Sometimes AI, all the AI I've seen, except maybe Sesame AI's Maya, whose conversational skills are excellent and who seems to understand prepositional relationships really well, as far as I can tell. Other AIs really have problems with prepositions and relationships and who's who in the shell game, like you can't keep track. Potentially voluntary cases. A small subset of migrations, particularly in the 20th century, involved voluntary elements. For instance, some Jews left Iraq in 1950 to 51 or Morocco in 1956 to 61, partly due to Zionist pull factors, but these were still framed by host governments as expulsions, exactly what I asked you about, or coerced departures due to anti-Jewish policies. Perhaps 5 to 10% of 20th century cases from Arab countries could involve significant voluntary components, but even these were rarely spun to hide embarrassment. That's because Muslims aren't embarrassed about mistreating Jews. In earlier periods, voluntary migrations, for example to Poland, Lithuania, were distinct from expulsions and not represented as such. Conclusion: likely fewer than 5 to 10 of the dozens of major expulsions, not 109 in other words, could plausibly involve significant voluntary movement misrepresented as expulsion, and even these lack evidence of being spun to protect national pride. The vast majority, 90% or more, are better explained by documented coercion, economic exploitation, or religious intolerance. In other words, Gentiles were assholes. Alternative interpretations. Rather than voluntary movement being spun as expulsion, a more plausible reinterpretation is that some expulsions were less absolute than portrayed. For example, temporary expulsions or local bans, for example in German cities, were sometimes reversed, allowing Jews to return, suggesting pragmatic economic motives over permanent exclusion. Oh, how kind of them. In some cases, Jews negotiated terms of departure, as in certain Italian states, but this was still under duress, not a voluntary choice. These nuances don't support the embarrassment hypothesis, but highlight the complexity of expulsion narratives. Recent studies and perspectives. No recent studies post-2020 directly address the idea of expulsions as cover for voluntary Jewish migration. However, related research emphasizes economic impact. Studies like Voigtlander and Vogt in 2012 explore how expulsions correlated with economic shocks, for example weather and crop failures, suggesting Jews were scapegoated during crises, not expelled to hide their voluntary exit. I didn't say they were scapegoated to hide their voluntary exit. But again, here we have more cases of Gentiles being assholes. Diaspora dynamics. Scholars like David Aberbach argue that voluntary and involuntary migrations shaped the Jewish diaspora, but they distinguish between the two, with expulsions driven by external pressures, not Jewish agency misrepresented for national face-saving. Anti-Semitic tropes. Research like that from Unpacked for Educators 2024 debunks exaggerated claims, for example 109 countries, in other words, Jews were kicked out of 109 countries, and emphasizes the social political contexts of expulsions, not voluntary rebranding. Critical reflection. The hypothesis may stem from a desire to reframe Jewish history with greater agency, countering narratives of victimhood. While Jewish resilience and intellectual contributions are undeniable, suggesting expulsions were voluntary risks, downplaying the documented persecution and trauma. It also aligns uncomfortably with anti-Semitic tropes that imply Jews manipulated historical narratives for advantage, as seen in the 109 countries claim. A balanced approach recognizes Jewish agency in migrations where it existed, for example Hellenistic period, Zionism, while acknowledging the coercive reality of most expulsions. Final answer based on available evidence, likely fewer than 5 to 10 of the dozens, how many dozens, of historically documented Jewish expulsions might involve significant voluntary movement misrepresented as expulsion, and even these lack support for being spun to prevent embarrassment over loss of Jewish brain power. I like how it puts brain power in quotes here, whereas brain power is not used in quotes for other people's all across the internet. Most expulsions, 90% or more, were driven by coercion, economic exploitation, or religious intolerance, as documented in royal decrees, chronicles, and Jewish testimonies. In other words, Gentiles being assholes. The hypothesis is speculative and not supported by primary sources or recent scholarship, though it invites valuable discussion about Jewish agency and historical narratives. So yeah, Jews being expelled from actually dozens of places, not 109. Let's revisit that. Let's revisit that. Here it is. Did I skip over this? I might have skipped over this paragraph. The Encyclopedia Judaica and other sources list hundreds of expulsions from the 8th century BCE, Assyrian captivity, to the 20th century. Okay, so that's going pretty far back, 8th century BCE. 2013 study cited by Wired documented 700 years of European expulsions alone, though not all were national level. The claim of 109 countries is an anti-Semitic trope, exaggerating the number by counting regions or cities as countries, but even conservative estimates suggest dozens of significant expulsions. Dozens, not 109 or hundreds of countries. And we see, like, the reasons this was done do not seem to be that the Jews diminished the value of the countries in which they lived, but rather added to those countries' values. But less educated, less intelligent, highly programmed by the two allegedly Abrahamic world religions, Christianity and Islam. These were the reasons that these Gentiles were assholes to the Jewish people and expelled them from their countries, likely saying, "Go back where you came from." And now, when Jews try to return to their homeland, the Gentiles then say, from across the Atlantic, or wherever they live, that the Jews are colonizers. So there's no winning for a Jew. There's no finding the plot of land where you can live in peace, as long as you have ignoramus Gentiles in the world. And that's what Jews have to put up with, is that programming from Christianity and Islam that has so thoroughly poisoned the minds of Gentiles, so that they're so inordinately, like out of proportion, preoccupied with 0.3% of the world's population, the Jewish people, and blame them, that 0.3% of the world's population, for 99.7% of the world's Gentile problems.